Hi, I'm Kayla Hathaway, a partner here at Cimpatico Studios. Cimpatico is a platform dedicated to cultivating conversations and actions on complex social issues with professionals all around the world. On the Climate EDU channel, I interview academics about university programs, careers, research, internships, and published literature like books and papers. If you're interested in being a guest, we'd love to hear from you. And now, on to today's show. Hello everyone and welcome back to Climate EDU. I am your host, Kayla Hathaway. I hope you enjoyed our two earlier episodes with Mike and Doug, and now you get to join me and Gerald Kootenay once again. We are on part 4 of his 5-part book series covering his book, Carbon Politics and the Failure of the Kyoto Protocol. And for those who may not have met Gerald yet, he is an author and media commentator on the politics of the climate crisis. He's authored the book, which we're talking about today, Carbon Politics and the Failure of the Kyoto Protocol. Gerald also has a consulting firm, Sixth Element, Sustainable Management, which specializes in helping entrepreneurs make their bioeconomy projects a success. Gerald, thank you so much for joining me once again. How is it's Wednesday, right? How's your Wednesday?
My Wednesday is fantastic. Glad to be back.
Cool. All right. Well, let's just jump right on into it. Part 4 of your book, and the EU deciding to pull some shenanigans as well.
Yeah, in the whole book, the message is trying to get across that I think people have a false impression what countries were actually doing in Kyoto. That some countries were really, really good, and they were planning to make great sacrifices for the greater good of the planet. And other countries were really evil, and they just didn't care about the planet.
Mm-hmm.
We talked earlier about the US and China, the two largest players, how they came about and what their negotiations were at Kyoto. And in this chapter, we're dealing with the EU. Mm-hmm. In those days, I'm not quite sure the EU had actually formed, but they had a European community in those days that a lot of the countries were involved in. And they essentially acted as a bloc in the Kyoto discussions. At Kyoto, generally, Germany was the major promoter. Angela Merkel was a major player in getting the Kyoto Agreement done. The part that was all people remember from Kyoto is Germany ended up with a reductions in their carbon emissions versus the 1990 target of like 21%. No other country was even close to it.
Yeah.
And the US, for example, the evil Americans, they only had 8, and they couldn't even get that 8% reduction. Mm-hmm. And so people generally thought, well, hey, Germany is really fantastic and the US is really bad. The point I was trying to make in the book was they were equals. All countries involved in the Kyoto negotiations weren't looking out for the world, they were looking out for themselves. But they all had different circumstances. And those individual circumstances is what separated the countries out.
And those different circumstances allowed for the EU to really kind of get into their own ways of addressing things, if I remember correctly, starting with the the emissions trading system.
Yeah, when it all started out, there was, I guess what was very good about Kyoto, it set up mechanisms, it set up protocols. So Kyoto was not a disaster. Just getting the world to have a standard rules for determining carbon emissions, for determining programs that people could accept to reduce their carbon emissions. Mm-hmm. Two of the favorites that are used in lots of areas of the world, but the EU really did a lot of the work after Kyoto was setting up. The first one was called feed-in tariffs.
Okay.
Feed-in tariffs were actually an American invention. It was used for wind energy, I think in the 70s in California and other places. And essentially a feed-in tariff was really simple. It was a subsidy to use renewable energy compared to the normal electrical rate. So the electrical rate would be charged higher to subsidize payments to whoever put in the renewable energy. Mm-hmm. Germany did it differently. What they set up was what was called it wasn't technology neutral. And so if you look at renewable energies, what Germany did was they had a lower rate for wind and biomass and other renewable energies. But for solar, the subsidy was about 3 times higher.
Oh.
What I always found strange was it wasn't 3 times higher versus coal. It was 3 times higher versus other renewable energies. And so it was the political favorite that came out. The point was that this just sent electrical rates through the roof. And at one point in time, Germany became the largest solar energy supplier in the world. And so it really distorted things. And so that was something that I certainly found uncomfortable with. I like the FIT program, the feed-in tariffs. I think it's a good one. But generally, I'm not quite sure it shouldn't be technology neutral. I don't see it's up to politicians to pick their favorites that should have a preferential rate. As far as the carbon emissions are concerned, it didn't care what renewables you use. What it cared about is how much were your carbon emissions reduced. So that's my little complaint about the feed-in tariff. Well, we had one here in Ontario. It was based exactly on the same one that Germany had. Spain had one as well. And it was great for the time that it was in solar. And today, solar doesn't need it. Solar is a very economic competitor. So from that point of view, it worked well. But again, I find it sort of a strange policy to put in. Mm-hmm. Policy in the EU was the emissions trading system. And this was really a program that the US had pushed very strongly for. These are one of the market-based mechanisms. And what that essentially says, and again, it was an American invention that really came up with this, is that a company could either reduce its emissions or it could buy emission reductions from another company that had extra emission reductions to sell. So it became like almost a share of carbon emissions. And actually, in principle, it's not that bad of a thing. So you take any industry. You can take, for example, a coal-powered utility plant. And under the emission trading systems, they would be allocated so much carbon emissions that they would be allowed per year. And every year, it would be ratcheted downward. It would become tighter and tighter and tighter. So far, so good. And so what would happen was, if a company was in an advantageous position to reduce their emissions by a lot, there was an incentive for them to do that. So even if they were way below their emissions, because then they could sell their extra emissions that were left over to another company who would be very expensive for whatever reason. And so they had a choice. You always had to meet your emissions reduction target, but you could do it by reducing it yourself or buying some of the extra emission reductions of others.
So it's kind of like a way to cheat yourself, or like to cheat the system out of your emissions targets, it sounds like.
It's a bit of a way of cheating, but again, at the end, the total carbon emissions of the country and the industry theoretically should be reduced. Mm-hmm. And that's the most important target. It was, and eventually, because the amount of emissions credits you got every single year was supposed to be reduced, eventually it was going to have to catch up to you. Mm-hmm. So again, that's why it's called a market-based mechanism. A company wasn't said, you have to do something.
Yeah.
As far as the putting in capital, or the case may be, but at least to begin with allowed you to take your time to do it. So it's certainly not the worst policy in the world. It certainly had some merits, but it wasn't exactly carried out in a fair way. Mm. The Europeans had different phases of this that went in it. Mm. And what happens to begin with, you have to assign the initial carbon credits so that an industry would get. Mm. And then that's shared through the big emitters. So every company would have so many emission credits they would be allowed. Well, the problem was everyone abused the system to death. And so people ended up getting more credits than they were even emitting at the time. And so what happened is that it went year after year, these guys they were actually making money because they could sell their emission credits. they weren't reducing their actual emissions. And after a phase of the emission trading system was over with, they hadn't contributed to any reductions whatsoever.
Oh my gosh.
This got worse in the first phase. It was terrible in the first phase, but that was a learning experience.
Yeah.
The second phase wasn't any better. All the countries were fighting for is the highest emission credits that they could get, instead of focusing on how to reduce the emissions.
Mhm.
Now, for other reasons, these countries were still reducing their greenhouse gas emissions. But the emission trading system, it never contributed to it at all, at least in the first and second phases of it.
It's kind of a bummer because, like, on paper, it reads like something like, oh, this could be in part of a solution. But then, I mean, that's kind of what a lot of things it seems like when trying to talk about climate is on paper. You're like, yes, absolutely. And the moment you go and put it in practice, and it's like, oh no.
And that's it exactly. And in fairness, this is a hard system to put into place.
Mhm.
So the first few years where it had its growing pains, so to speak, but afterwards there was no excuse for it. The people that were negotiating for the emission credits weren't the same people that were in charge of the greenhouse gas emissions.
Got
So
it.
they were taking care of their industry. Now, it's a lot of countries do that, by the way. It's not your Department of the Environment that goes to Kyoto. It's not the EPA, for example, for the US that went to Kyoto. It's usually members of the Department of State. And that's not unusual for when countries go. Some of them were sending environmental regulators there, but also there was other people there that were in charge of something different than simply taking care of the environment.
That just feels very weird. Like, even though that's the norm, it just feels weird. Because if you're having a meeting about environmental issues and climate issues, it just would make sense to have your climate and environment people present. But what do I know? I'm not a politician, so.
Well, neither am I, and I think both of us are glad we're not right now.
Yeah. Well, so we have the emissions trading system that was talked about, but then there was also like these kind of reductions that you had listed as like hot air and wall fall. Like, what were those, and what was like the? See your face. They seem.
Let me talk about the hot air.
Hot air. All right, let's go.
The EU, when it looked at their carbon reductions, they had one for each individual country, and they also had one for the EU combined.
Okay.
And after the Soviet bloc fell apart, and you had many Eastern European countries joining I think it was called the EC27 or EU27. They were joining the European community. And so that whole bloc had a target for carbon emissions. Well, what happened was, not only did they not have to do anything to meet their huge reduction in targets, some of the countries just blew it away. If you look in the first phase of Kyoto, the largest reductions in the world came from the Ukraine. That noted country that's so famous for its carbon emissions. And other Eastern European countries as well had huge reduction in their carbon emissions. They weren't installing solar, they weren't installing wind. Well, where did this all come from? It came from hot air. When the Soviet bloc collapsed, its industry was the most archaic industry, energy intensive processes anywhere in the world. And so after the Soviet bloc fell apart, they weren't competitive. Their economies were a basket case because of this, and these factories simply shut down. So the only reason that the emissions were reduced was because of the faltering economy on antiquated technology. But yet every one of those countries got emission trading credits, which they could sell. And it's incredible. Now, these countries were in dire straits.
Yeah.
So we'll say, okay, they got a little bit of an excuse. So first of all, the EU at the time meeting their carbon targets was really, it was so sad it was almost a joke. Let's talk about Germany for a minute, which outside Kyoto had developed the image of being the climate leader in the world. Some of it was a little bit justified, a little tiny bit of it only. They were taking care of themselves quite nicely. If you look at the final carbon targets for Germany, and it's always versus your 1990 emissions. That was the target year that was based on. Germany had to reduce their emissions by 21%. No other developed country had anything close to that.
Mm-hmm.
The US, by comparison, was 7%. Now, that's what the 1990 target was. By the end of Kyoto, that's what they had to do.
Okay.
But by 1995, which was the latest emission data that was available when Kyoto was being negotiated in 97, Germany was now, like, I forget the number, 10% away from meeting their target, and the US was now 14%. In the year 2000, that's when Germany finally ratified Kyoto and made it law. So they had not really done anything major by then. Germany was then 3% away from meeting their target before they had even ratified, and the US was now like 24% away.
Yeah.
Oh,
Oh, you're good.
getting too excited here.
So it's
What
like
happened?
Germany, why did they have that advantage? Like,
They had their own hot air, and it
oh,
was called the wall fall.
okay.
Because when the Berlin Wall came down and Germany unified, Eastern Germany was in the same basket case that most of the countries in Eastern Europe were under the Soviet domain. The economy was so bad that it stretched the German economy overall to the limit, even though West Germany was a powerhouse. Oh, again, the same things happened. East Germany industry simply shut down. And so even though they had that 21% reduction, they had to do nothing to meet their Kyoto target. And so later on, Germany certainly did install wind and did some good things. Don't get me wrong, there weren't some bad things out of this. But the one thing they always protected was their coal-fired power plants. They had some of the largest coal subsidies in the world through most of the 2000s. I'm not trying to pick on Germany. Again, the whole focus, maybe I am trying to pick on Germany. My whole focus is to show, though, that each country was taking advantage of where they could. The one thing that was very clear in the negotiations of the EU versus the US, part of their negotiation plan was to get the US as close to the EU reductions as possible. Why? Not to meet some sort of glorious target for carbon reductions, was to make them have the same non-competitive carbon targets versus the European ones. So the idea, the EU one, I believe, ended up being at 8% for 1990 to reduce their carbon emissions. So, and they played hardball with the US, and they completely out-negotiated the American negotiating team. It was embarrassing what happened in Kyoto as far as the Americans were concerned. The Europeans got everything they wanted, and the Americans got nothing. And in the end, of course, the Americans did not ratify Kyoto. They never joined.
Yeah, at the end of the day, the US was like, no thanks. Bye.
And so what happened was, as soon as they got the US to have -7, they generally had a big gain in their competitive position, because for them to meet their targets, it was easy. And for the Americans, it was literally impossible.
Gotta love these like loopholes when it comes down to like these kind of like global conversations, yeah?
Well, it shows how and face it, the press may not have dug into it. Like, this is all public information. There's nothing secret in the book. And they're all open governments. And the US knew what the Germans were doing. Okay, the Americans were not stupid. They knew that the Germans had this advantage, but there was so much public pressure to make Kyoto work.
Mhm.
And Germany played their cards perfectly as far as the media was concerned and was the darling. And so whatever Germany wanted, there was like 90% of the world was in favor of it without knowing
Jeez.
the details what was going on.
Yeah.
And so at the end of the day, the press made Germany the hero. They made the US were the evil ones. And again, in my opinion, and from the analysis I've done, there was no difference really at the end of the day between the negotiating position of the US versus Germany, and generally among most countries overall.
Mm. Man, well, thank you so much for joining me for part 4 of our 5-part series and for shining the light on the fact that Kyoto was a disaster. Well, next week is our last episode, and do you want to give us a little peek into what part 5 is about?
Part 5 is a short chapter. I give a few ideas of what I thought should have been done or how it could have been done better. Now, this was back around 2012 when I was writing this stuff, so things have changed, but certainly a few points in those book haven't changed as we've gone along. So we'll wrap a little bit about some of the things that, how do you get around all this mess? It's easy to complain about Kyoto. And again, I have to stress, the bureaucracy that was set up for administrating carbon emissions was worth a lot, but people expected a lot more. And the bottom line is we haven't reduced global emissions at all. And so that part is still the critical part. But the administrative part of Kyoto was actually an incredible achievement in its own right. It was lost in all the hoopla of the parties of what was happening. And we'll just wrap a little bit of, well, how else could you have done something like this?
It was the first, well, aside from, I think it was like Rio, leading up to Kyoto, but it was kind of like the first step. And then we have Paris, later on down the line and all of our meetings now. So even though it wasn't perfect, and I don't think we will ever have a perfect policy, I don't think that is even achievable. But it was a step in the right direction. And I think that's kind of like the biggest takeaway from it. And it was a big lesson learned, that's for sure.
Well, I agree with you totally. It was definitely a step in the right direction. And negotiating international treaties about anything, where it's truly international, where you have to get almost 200 countries agreed to it, is a nightmare. It doesn't matter what you're trying to achieve. And so that they got so far so as quickly as they did, yeah, that was special. But that is what is special about Kyoto.
All right, Gerald, we're going to roll into just chatting, so we'll be right back.
Okay, thanks again.